Well, welcome to this month's Story of Scripture in a Year reading. We're in May, and we're covering 2 Samuel, the rest of Psalms, 1 Chronicles, Song of Solomon, and Proverbs. So in this month's reading, we're actually going to follow the story of David. We're going to follow how he really hits the heights of his kingship and also the very depths of the lowest parts of his kingship. Mixed into the reading is going to feel a little bit like we're reading David's journal entries. And so both David and Solomon, they actually give us insight into the emotive state and response based off of the historical situations that they're walking through. And so as you're reading these Psalms that are kind of interdispersed as they're placed in between the different chapters of reading, I want you to think about them as journal entries that gives us real insight into it. And maybe one of the most assuring things that we learn from seeing these Psalms side by side with their historical context is the freedom that it gives you and I to be truly human. Like, it's good to feel our full humanity. It is okay to be human and to express our emotions and simultaneously, and you're going to see this, we're going to talk about this in the Psalms. It's one thing to feel our emotions. It's a totally different thing to be dictated by our emotions. So we want to put all these feelings in front of God with honesty, and we always want to remember, and this is the major theme of our story of Scripture, that God is a good dad. And so he's not going to leave us to be led by our emotions, but as we present our emotions to him, he's going to help us to process our emotions appropriately. So let's get started. I want to start in 2 Samuel. And again, we're just going to do some highlight reels of some sections of the scripture that I think are important for us to grapple with. In 2 Samuel 13, verses 3 through 4, I'll read this. It says, Amnon had a friend, this is one of David's sons. Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, a son of David's brother Shimea. Jonadab was a very shrewd man, and he asked Amnon, "Why are you, the king's son, so miserable every morning?" "Won't you tell me?" Amnon replied. "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Okay, a couple things to notice here. Notice that Jonadab was a shrewd man. This language of shrewd or crafty, it ought to bring us an echo of the serpent in Eden. Remember, in Eden, the serpent was a crafty animal, more crafty and more wise, more shrewd, I guess, than any other animal in existence. And so when we're presented with this individual, and when the text calls him a shrewd man, we almost want to experience and to place ourselves in another echo situation of somebody who's presented with an opportunity to see something that they love, desire it, and take it for themselves. And there's always this temptation. There's always this person who kind of comes along as a person who's going to offer what they're going to call wisdom, but in fact, it is treachery at best. And so just from a practical standpoint, y'all, we really should be aware of Jonadab types of friends. People that are wise, they're cunning. I should say they appear wise. They're cunning, they're shrewd, and yet at the core of their so-called wisdom is going to be suggestions and motivations that are actually corrupt from the inside out. And so you have this really horrific, very sad story that happens where Tamar really is abused and taken advantage of. And what we're supposed to actually, I think, see here is that the story of Amnon and Tamar is really the inverse of the David story and the Shunammite woman who cares for David on his deathbed as we kind of fast forward to the end of his life. So here, Amnon, he actually creates death and decay and destruction on his bed when he takes something that didn't belong to him. Sadly, Tamar even says, like, hey, like, don't do this. If you just ask our father David, if you just ask David, David's going to give you permission to marry me. But what Amnon is after, this is very important. Amnon is after, he's not after intimacy of relationship. He's motivated by lust and possession of a person. This also explains why at the very end of the scene, he is disgusted with Tamar. The text says that he hates her. Well, really, I don't think it's so much that he hates her. I think that he's felt with the guilt and the conviction of what he's done. So he hates himself. And while he hates himself, he pours out his hatred onto her. Now, we're left with the tension here. And remember, we're talking about family and household, and God is a good father. And we're going to see presented in different ways how when discipline is not enacted upon children, these children go reckless and wild. So here's this big question. Why doesn't David discipline Amnon? This is a blatant flaw in David's story and his character. Father failures are real issues. See, the discipline of God is evidence of love. A lack of discipline isn't love. It's actually evidence of carelessness and even cruelty. And so when David actually does not discipline Amnon, he also is placing Tamar in a place of real unjust living, which is really horrific. Okay, we'll move on. 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 6 says this. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot, horses, and 50 men to run before him. He would get up early and stand beside the road leading to the city gate. So Absalom is another one of David's sons, totally reckless, inciting rebellion. And it says this. Whenever anyone had a grievance to bring before the king for settlement, Absalom called out to him and asked, What city are you from? If he replied, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel, Absalom said to him, look, your claims are good and right, but the king doesn't have anyone to listen to you. He added, if only someone would appoint me judge in the land, then anyone who had a grievance or dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he received justice. When a person approached to pay homage to him, Absalom reached out his hand, took hold of him, and kissed him. Absalom did this to all the Israelites who came to the king for a settlement. So Absalom, look at this, stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Again, I'm going to just show how this story now of Absalom, a different son of David, it's actually another echo story. What is the echo story here? Absalom figures an image of Satan, a Satan-type figure who attempts to, look at the language, steal the hearts of humanity. This also, as we get into Proverbs, this creates this cross-reference with wisdom, who's calling out into the streets, and then also folly, who's pursuing us. So sitting out in the street and leading people away, all of this is happening. This is what the serpent does. This is what Satan is doing. He's leading us away based off of what feels like immediate goodwill for us, but it's actually long-term destruction for us. We find this in Proverbs 9, 13 through 18, that folly is a rowdy woman. She is gullible and she knows nothing. She sits by the doorway of her house on a seat at the highest point. I mean, this all sounds like Absalom, doesn't it? Calling to those who pass by, who go straight ahead on their paths. Whoever is inexperienced, enter here. So in the same way that these individuals should have known, hey, what Absalom is offering isn't even for him to offer. And then secondarily, we should probably go to David and let David know these people have their hearts stolen by Absalom. This is what folly, a rowdy woman, what this foolishness is actually producing. So we have now these two stories of David's sons, right? Family members that ought to have the best interest of the household, and they don't. Their actions cause division, destruction in the household. Again, another kind of massive pattern that's happening is sometimes the people that are the closest inside of the family are the ones that are causing the most chaos and confusion. And then you have this odd story in 2 Samuel 15, where we're introduced to another character, and I think this is all intentional. It's supposed to show comparison and contrasting, and we find presence of Gentile inclusion. So King David is running for his life. He's running away. And as he's running away, he notices that a Gentile general is going with him. And so this is what it says. The king said to Ittai of Gath, why are you also going with us? This is 2 Samuel 15, 19 through 21. Go back and stay with the new king, since you're both a foreigner and an exile from your homeland. Besides, you only arrived yesterday. Should I make you wander around with us today while I go wherever I can? Go back and take your brothers with you. May the Lord show you, look at this is such grace of David. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness. But in response, Ittai vowed to the king, as the Lord lives, and as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king is, whether it means life or death, your servant will be there. Fascinating to me. Sometimes I wonder how David felt in this moment. Here he has had this experience of his two sons that really rebelled and revolted against him. And now you have this Gentile general, leader of an army, who has no reason to stay with you, and yet is showing more loyalty to the household than his own sons. Yeah. Well, this is also, I think, something to remind us of, that even in the New Testament, where we get the sense that not all who are of Israel are Israel, right? Like there's some of us that have been grafted into the family of God. These echoes of Gentile inclusion are presented as seeds in the Old Testament for you and I to experience the fullness of the inclusion of all the nations into the household of God. And that's why I want to draw out these stories as something really important that we could easily overlook. But again, think about the cost associated with this. There is always a reason for the repetition of Scripture, and we see it here. Another thing that's happening with David is we have this echo and comparison of the story of David in comparison with the story of Jesus. And remember, Jesus comes into humanity through the incarnation as the greater David. So what do we have? We have got David who's running away from literal death, right? From his son who's rebelled. So David's running away from death through the valley, the Kidron Valley, and up the mountain. So the Mount of Olives. So verse 22, David crosses the Kidron Valley. Verse 30, David climbs the slope of the Mount of Olives and escapes the city. And then it tells us that David weeps all along, right? Fast forward to Jesus in Mark 14, 26 through 31. By the time that Jesus is around the Kidron Valley, it was known to have all these different tombs that were kind of all over the place. And so literally, when it says like, Jesus is like, I'm walking through the valley of death, like literally that's what's happening in the Kidron Valley. So what's happening in Mark 14, Jesus walks towards his death through what? The valley, the Kidron Valley, and down the mountain. What mountain is this? The Mount of Olives. You see, Jesus crosses the Kidron Valley. He climbs down the Mount of Olives. The Garden of Gethsemane was a olive grove on the east side of the Kidron Valley at the foot of the Mount of Olives. And Jesus weeps over the city because of sin that has entered in and has created all kinds of chaos. So fascinating to me that one king, David, he's running away from the city, through the valley, up the mountain, and weeps as he's running away from death. And then you have Jesus, the King of Kings, who doesn't run away from death. He's running towards death. He goes through the valley of death and he comes down the mountain and he weeps all the way. Why? Because Jesus is determined to defeat death through death itself. Pretty fascinating. And then we get, dispersed throughout this different Psalms. We come across one Psalm that I think is really important. Psalm 4:4, it says this: "Be angry and do not sin. Reflect in your heart while on your bed and be silent." Okay, what does this actually mean? Be angry and do not sin. Does this mean, hey, don't be angry and don't sin? Or in your anger, don't sin? Is this giving us right to just go ahead, be angry, So we need to cross-reference this with a couple other stories and places of Scripture. In Ephesians 4:26 and 27, Paul says to the church in Ephesus, "Be angry and do not sin." This is an echo. This is a citation of Psalm 4:4. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, and don't give, look at this, the devil an opportunity. That's fascinating. Where does Paul get this idea? Paul actually is getting this idea from not only Psalm 4:4, but the origin story of Psalm 4:4, which is Genesis 4:6 through 7. Look at this. In the story of Cain and Abel, the first murder on earth, then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you furious and why do you look despondent or anxious? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door." Look at the language. Its desire is for you. You must rule over it. So you've got this combination. It's like, hey, it's okay to feel the emotion of anger, but in the midst of your anger, do not sin. Do not give yourself up to temptation, because in that place of anger, the enemy is waiting to lead you down a path of destruction. As we read through the Psalms, particularly as it's related to David's story, we find this downward slope that actually mirrors the impact of the tension of depression and hope that David has. So in Psalm 3 and 4, you got much more hopeful. This is kind of earlier on in all these hard situations that David is dealing with. But then Psalm 13, 28, and 55, you get much more desperation. You get much more anxiety and frustration. And you still have the commitment of resolving all of this with hope. I think what this is showing us is it's human nature early on when things are really difficult to be more hopeful, right? And so that's how life is framed. But the longer we're in despair, it is natural to become more desperate, and we can voice that desperation. What's really important is we don't live lives absent of the hope that is present in front of us, that Jesus provides us on the cross that we know of today. And the same thing was for David, that David, even though that he was dealing with some really hard things, and seasons had passed and days and months had passed, he was still going to be honest of the state of desperation of his human heart, while also being committed to the hope that he had in God. In Psalm 5:6, chapter 5:6, I love this. David's like, God knocked the teeth out of their mouths. I think of a boxer who's going to punch and knock somebody's teeth out. It's a phrase. This is kind of a Hebraic phrase that's basically saying, like, destroy these people's power and ability to do evil. So the other example here is fangs of a lion or a serpent. Like, if you fanged a serpent or defanged a lion, they are now powerless to hurt you, right? You take a outdoor cat and you declaw them, they're not going to survive outdoors anymore. Their ability to do harm and even to protect themselves is actually taken away. And so this is really, David's like, hey, strip them of their power and their ability. Another example of Gentile inclusion is in 2 Samuel 21, 1-3. Fascinating that during David's reign, there's a famine, a 3-year kind of successive famine. And so David reaches out to the Lord. He's like, hey, what do I do? And God answers, it's actually because of Saul. So this is what the Lord answered. It is due to Saul and to his bloody family because he killed the Gibeonites. Now, really important, the Gibeonites were not Israelites, but they were a remnant of the Amorites. So the Israelites had taken an oath concerning them, but Saul had tried to kill them in his zeal for Israelites and Judah. So this is a story of how God cares about even those that are not Israelites, because there's injustice and unrighteousness that is done unto them. And so this is, another example of Gentile inclusion. Now we're going to move into the Song of Solomon. Fascinating detail about the Song of Solomon. For most Hebrew children, they were not even allowed to read the Song of Solomon because of its high romantic, could somebody say, sexual nature of the psalm. And so this was kind of reserved for people who are about to get married. There's a couple different historical ways. So the book itself, the Song of Solomon, is a poetic book that features around 6 poems. And it really describes and celebrates the physical romance between this unnamed man and a female figure. So like a man who's betrothed who's going to marry this woman. So a couple kind of ways that you can interpret this. Traditionally, there was this allegorical interpretation. Basically, the romantic love that was portrayed in this relationship was taken to allegorically represent the love of God for his people, the love of God for the church. So you've got this allegorization of this. And then later on, you would have what's referred to as a spiritual interpretation. So in the centuries that are leading up to the Reformation, there were specific monastic figures that kind of come onto the scene, and they're going to use the language of the bridegroom, and they want to individualize and spiritualize the allegory. So monastic theologians and mystics found this whole imagery, this whole poetic, romantic situation to be an expression of the individual's union relationship with God. So this spiritual marriage kind of tradition is found in poetic writings of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and others. Then you have some other interpretations. Some of these are modern interpretations. You have the dramatic interpretation. Origen observed centuries earlier that there's this dramatic kind of flair and feel to the Song of Solomon. Now, we don't have any evidence this was actually put and placed in a dramatic scene like a theater scene, but we have plenty of evidence that presents this as types of scenes that are happening throughout the book. So it could be this unraveling that is meant to be dramatic in nature. And then another example is lyrical interpretation, where this is kind of a series of poems that would have been read in light of a wedding. And so you've got different ways that you can kind of read this, and different scholars who are going to communicate it. And then finally, we have Proverbs. Proverbs Along with other Old Testament literature, it personifies wisdom. The Hebrew word for wisdom is hakma. The Greek term is Sophia. And really important, before this was ever written, this was all oral tradition. Think of your wise sayings of your grandparents, and they would sit you down and I have one. My grandmother used to always tell me, she would say, Joel, your life is like a newspaper and the world is going to read it, right? So you've got this proverbial kind of principle that was passed down first in oral tradition, and then finally it was written as a long form collection. There are a couple reasons why we may want to affirm Solomon's authorship. I'm going to quote Bruce Waltke and the 4 reasons that he gives. One is the history in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. It actually matches Proverbs. 2, the structure and content of Proverbs is similar to comparable wisdom literature from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other cultures in the region, dating the time period of Solomon's reign. Now, we know Solomon was well-versed in the cultures around him, and he had a lot of wisdom, and so part of that was probably learning from the wisdom of the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, so this kind of makes sense. And then number 3, linguistic evidence matches well with Solomon as the author, okay? And then the last one, wisdom literature is typically set in the context of a kingly court. And we have that kind of happening, Proverbs 1 through 15, and then 31 through 36. Well, how should we read Proverbs? Well, Proverbs makes a link between godly wisdom and righteousness. So in other words, there is a goal to enacted wisdom, and that goal to enacted wisdom is to live righteous lives. The Hebrew word sadiq, which is righteous or righteousness, occurs 66 times in Proverbs. That's a high frequency level. So there's a point to all of these proverbial sayings. Be righteous, be upright, do the right thing, right? And again, very important, these are expressions of general truths, not guarantees. These are principles, not promises. Proverbs presents a lot of imagery, and there's a lot of figurative language. And so some things that you want to look at are the presence of similes or metaphor, allegory, personification, irony, the literary type, the imagery that's present in front of us, or the poetic structure of the proverb. It's going to help us to interpret it appropriately. For example, you'll have this thing called a type of parallelism. So one is an antithetical parallelism, where you've got this proverbs that's split into 2 halves, and they present opposite perspectives from each other. Or you have a better than parallelism, where you've got one statement, and the one that comes after it is better, right? And the last one is a numerical parallelism. It's kind of like the better than, but it's building on it. You have a certain number of examples that are provided as an illustration, and as each example goes, so it's it's numerical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As each one goes, it's intensified and increased as the numbers go on. So in this month's reading, you're going to find a lot of pretty amazing things that are narratively driven through the story of David. You get a journal entry into David, and so even some of Solomon's kind of lived emotional experience. And then we're left with a bunch of wisdom sayings and some, you're going to read the Song of Songs, and we're going to experience romanticism and the beauty of marriage. And so this is a fun month. Next month, we're going to keep working. And like usual, I want to always remind you guys that we've got, what I'm reading from is the CSB Day by Day Chronological Bible. It makes our Bible reading so easy. I'll link to that in the show notes and the captions underneath this. And this has been so fun. And I've got, we're making some progress. Look at this. This is kind of where we are right now. And so we're well over 30, almost 40% of our Bible reading, which is pretty significant. I want to encourage you, keep going. You can absolutely do this. And if you haven't already, I would love for you also to pick up my book, The Hidden Peace, Finding True Strength, Security, and Confidence Through Humility. It's available wherever books are being sold. At the very end of it, are 13 devotional ideas on humility that you can actually learn how to cultivate humility in your life. I actually think that humility is intensely important for how we read and study scripture. So hopefully that'll be available. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Appreciate y'all. Can't wait to dig deeper next month.